Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. Today we are talking about the movie adaptation of 1408, and I am joined by a brand new guest, Robert Yaniz Jr. Robert, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Deanna. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was pleasantly surprised by this movie. I have to say, it's one of the ones where we have a short story being adapted, or, a shorter story for Stephen King.
Right.
And this is a movie that I had only heard a little bit about, and I don't know if that's just because it's not a book adaptation. I feel like sometimes the short story or novella adaptations kind of fly under the radar a little more than the big ones like Pet Sematary. I think Shawshank might be the biggest novella adaptation along with Stand By Me. So for me, I hadn't heard too terribly much about this. Had you watched this movie prior to signing up for it for the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that was one of the ones that really jumped out to me because I saw 1408 in the theaters and loved it. And I've owned the DVD for many years, and I actually hadn't revisited it in a while. So this was definitely a movie that really resonated with me and continues to do so, even more so now.
Yeah, this was something that was very interesting to watch at the tail end of 2020 because this is very much a one person being isolated a lot movie.
Yeah, yes, it absolutely is.
But to jump in, I want to quickly talk a little about the cast and crew because this is the first of two movies that John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson are in together. And it's always interesting to me who returns to Stephen King movies and how small or big a cast will be for any given adaptation. So aside from the two of them, you have Cusack playing the main character, Mike Enslin. You have Samuel L. Jackson playing Mr. Olin. But then you really only have 3 or 4 other characters that are of significance in this. You have Mary McCormack as Lily, who is Mike's not necessarily estranged wife, but they've clearly been separated because their daughter, Katie, died, and she comes into play. And then you have Tony Shalhoub as Sam Farrell, Mike's agent, from what I can tell. And a lot of people know him from Monk. And then you have Len Carew, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, as Mike's father. But, other than John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson, everyone else is sort of just a side character.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is in large part a one-man show by John Cusack.
Yeah.
We spend the vast majority, I'd say at least an hour of the hour and 45 minute or so long runtime in the room with him. And even the other characters that show up, a lot of them are either, specters in the room or just like some kind of, manifestation of his own psychosis. There's a lot to dig into in this one. And that's why I think it's an interesting one to talk about because, as you said, a lot of people haven't heard about it. And it came out and was a hit. And it's kind of fallen under the radar a little bit over the years.
Yeah, and this is one that I often see paired with other movies. And, sometimes you'll get these Stephen King sets where it's like, I think there's a 8-movie box set or something that's like The Master of Horror or King of Horror or something along those lines. But when I was looking for 1408 in particular, I've run into this problem where sometimes I'll need one movie or TV miniseries, and then it's only bundled with other things that I already own. And I'm just like, why are you doing this? But I think this was one that you could fairly easily find on its own, but it is included in some double set. Maybe it's this and Cell because Cusack and Jackson are both in those. I can't recall right now, but I feel like those two, even though the actors are both very big names, you don't hear too much about them. And Cell, I imagine it's because it's not that great, but I think 1408 pleasantly surprised me with how good it was.
Yeah, I think there's a lot about the movie that makes it stand out. I think the sort of isolation aspect of it. There's also a lot of classic Stephen King tropes sort of at play here. The focus is on a writer. He's dealing with family trauma. That's the dinner scene where he's having dinner with Lily. That felt like straight out of The End of Misery to me. Like there's a lot of elements in here that feel like they're riffing on other King stories and better known adaptations. And I feel like that may be one of the maybe if I had to criticize something about this movie, that might be one of the things I would throw at it. But I think for the most part, it's really fascinating. Like I put it on last night in preparation for this episode, and I didn't pause it. I didn't go get a snack or nothing. I was like enveloped in it for the whole runtime. And I think that it really holds up to rewatch in that way. It's like in a way that a lot of movies don't. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and because this is a movie that came out in the mid to late 2000s,
yeah,
it was 2008, I think, at least for the Blu-ray release of it.
Right.
But I felt like even though a lot of this relies on, some sort of trickery with the camera and CGI, it didn't look as bad as I was expecting it to either.
Yeah, it only cost $25 million, which for a movie that has this much going on as far as like the supernatural elements of it, it's actually pretty low budget. And as you mentioned, Deanna, with the two big names kind of at the front as well.
Yeah, and it actually looks like the official release date for the movie itself was June 22nd, 2007. So, the home video release probably came towards the end of the year, early 2008, something like that. There were long gaps between these things. And I know now in early 2021 here, all of that kind of stuff is up in the air. And I do want to quickly mention that this was directed by Mikael Hafstrom. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because there's umlauts and I am very bad at pronouncing names, but I don't know too much about this director. And, maybe that's just because I don't watch a lot of foreign stuff, but it looks like he has done quite a few movies, and he did 5 or 6 even just before this. So I think having this less familiar name attached to it as well is something that makes this one that maybe people don't seek out quite as much.
Yeah, I think the only other Hofstrom directed film that I've seen is Escape Plan, which he did a couple years later, which was just basically notable because Schwarzenegger and Stallone kind of co-starred in it. But that's the only, other than that, in 1408, that's all I really know about him. So yeah, it's strange that when that happens, when a movie this strong comes out, is successful, and then the director doesn't really, like his career didn't really explode in the way you might expect.
Yeah, and it looks like his next movie, Shanghai, actually also had John Cusack in it. So maybe there's just some sort of relationship there that we don't know about. He's done a movie with Anthony Hopkins too. So obviously he has a very specific skill set, it seems, just from quickly looking at the movies. There's sort of this horror element, but also this sort of time bending element, especially in this one. And I think when I read the story, I didn't really have a good visualization of how that would look on the screen. And that's where this surprised me, because obviously you have the CGI ghosts who are very computerized, to say the least, because the way they are glitching out and the way he's seeing them, it definitely looks like some CGI that they didn't have quite figured out, or it was a very specific style that they were going for, because all of them looked like that for the most part. Yeah. You obviously have the other scenes where he wasn't seeing people who were dead. He would see his father, for instance, so his father didn't look the same. And I just really love the aesthetic of the movie and how the story was portrayed.
Yeah, I do too. I think the way that this movie was shot is really interesting. Style, we get cool images like the key going into the lock, and we get like an internal view of him turning the key, and they really build up the mythology of this I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but of this evil effing room. So it's, by the time you actually get in there and all this stuff, everything starts going wild. I think the audience is primed and ready for all of that to happen. And the way that it's executed, it has way much of a slow burn element to it than a lot of horror movies, I think. In that he doesn't really start panicking in the room until about 40 minutes in. It's just all discussions of what his career is, that he's a writer, and then he just goes to haunted locales, and that's sort of his deal. We get hints at like a tragic history in his family with his father, and then later with his daughter. And so by the time you get to that point where things start going crazy, and you get the ghosts, and he sees himself across the street in a window.
Yeah,
it's kind of mirroring back his own trauma, basically. And by the time that happens, you have that sustained level of tension, but you're also kind of enveloped in the familiar atmosphere of a hotel room in the way that the character is. You know what I mean? It puts you in his shoes, and I think that John Cusack is such a perfect choice for that, because he does kind of have that inherent everyman quality. Mm-hmm. And giving him the device of talking into the tape recorder gives him something to play off of, because otherwise he's just a kind of a silent movie for a lot of it.
Right.
And I think that it's so well constructed that it's just, as the movie plays out, it's kind of like it kind of feels like it's the room basically like psychologically breaks you down, and like it feels like it diagnoses your worst trauma and then leans into it, because early on we do get elements of like with his father appearing there and things like that, and then until the room really hones in on the Katie aspect of it all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that it's a slow burn, but it's not so slow that you are bored by it. What it does well is, at the beginning, we don't know what his trauma is. I mean, obviously, if you've read the story, and I felt like this movie did a very good job of letting that all unfold at the proper pace, because if we're hit with all of this information, like, here's this writer, his daughter died, he's not with his wife anymore, that would have been an overload that wouldn't have had the same kind of payoff in the end.
Yeah, it's that classic screenwriting lesson that it's, or actually really a writing lesson in general, that just, the audience doesn't need to know something until it's imperative to the story. It's like, you don't need to exposition dump at the beginning. Like, we don't even learn anything. We don't even learn that he was married or any of that until it's like layers by layers, as the room is sort of getting to know him, I guess, for lack of a better term. We learn more about him. So the thing with his father, which we only get a very small hint of, his relationship there at the beginning when the fan approaches him in the bookstore about the book that he wrote about his relationship with his dad. We learn about Lily as it kind of unfolds. It really smartly leans into that in a gradual way, starting with like easy, like light scares, like, oh, the radio went on all of a sudden, or there's mints on my pillow, and he's like the ultimate skeptic, because he's gone through all these haunted places, written all these books about it,
right,
and lost faith along the way in an afterlife, in God or whatever. And so we're watching him slowly unravel over the course of the first half of the movie, and then when he actually does realize he's trapped in the room, it has that much more impact, because he's early on holding the tape, trying to be like, oh, so they came in here. And then they come into the living room, and that means they're over here. And then he's telling his tape recorder, we don't rattle, that kind of thing. So I love all that like slow, that like gradual kind of descent into madness that you see with him. And it's really compelling to watch, and kind of intense, to the point that I remember when I saw it in theaters, I remember walking out of there and having a headache, because I was like, that was a lot. As it goes later on, especially, it gets really emotionally heavy with the Katie thing later on. So it's always been one that I've really enjoyed watching, and just Cusack just kills it in this movie.
He really does. And I had been familiar with him in passing from some of his work in, I think, the early 2000s. And Samuel L. Jackson is the one who is most familiar to me as a superhero nerd as well. I know him as Nick Fury and have seen him in all of those roles. And I really felt like, not only is this a very different role than him as Nick Fury, but it's something where he doesn't need to be the main person either, which is really great.
Yeah, and he doesn't really have much screen time. I mean, on the poster, it's the two of them, and it's John Cusack, Samuel L. Jackson, obviously, because Jackson's a huge name. But he really has kind of a couple scenes in the hotel beforehand. Most notably back in his office where he's really trying to dissuade Enslin from going in the room with the $800 bottle of liquor and like, you can have access to my office, all these notes and blah, blah, put it in your book. Just don't stay in the room. And other than that, you don't really see him, at least in the theatrical cut. There's an alternate endings, which maybe we can talk about in a minute. But in the theatrical cut, you don't see him after Enslin goes in the room until the very end when he's taking a drink and he's like, well done, or, kind of congratulating Mike on defeating the room, basically.
Yeah, he appears in the refrigerator.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. He does. That's true. He does. I think that's true. I forgot about that. That's a fun scene too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's you need an actor of Jackson's caliber to carry that scene in the office, to have that impact that it does, where he makes a very compelling argument, and it feels like a real battle of wits with the two of them kind of facing off in that scene, even though we all know how it's going to go because the movie's called 1408, so obviously he's got to end up in the room. But you kind of understand both of them and why Enslin is so intent on going in the room. One, because I feel like, and Deanna, I want to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like Enslin clearly has some kind of a death wish because he's really intent on going in that room. Like, I think on some level he's just like in a self-destructive mode. I think you can see obviously with the constant drinking, with what are your thoughts on that? Do you think he's in such pain that he's just like, if I die like these 56 people in 1408, then I'm better off because of what happened with my daughter and all that stuff? Do you have any what are your thoughts on what Mike Enslin's motivation is in that scene?
I think how they set it up, where he stops at this hotel sort of in the middle of nowhere at the very beginning of the movie, and he goes around the room, he's talking into his recorder, and he just seems so bored with these people who are saying, oh, we have this haunted room, because they almost trick you into thinking that's going to be the room, but then they're like, oh, it's just room 14. It's not room 1408. So they kind of play with you a little at the beginning, and then it turns out to be nothing. So I think it's a combination of him being intrigued by this postcard that just says, don't go into 1408. And then as he does the research, he's finding out all of these things that actually happened. So I think he's looking at it as an opportunity to finally have something worthwhile to go check out. Mm-hmm. And the fact that his trauma just piles on top of that as things unfold in the room. I think he maybe didn't necessarily go into it having a death wish. He was just very adamant about finally having a story worth telling. Mm-hmm. But by the end of it, he was like, yeah, this was a death wish.
Yeah. And the arc that he has, I really love the way that he starts out sort of believing in nothing. Obviously, I feel like multiple characters tell him that over the course of the movie, that he's lost faith, not only in religion, but just like in people. Just he's kind of living kind of a nomadic lifestyle, basically. And then by the end, reconciles with his wife, makes peace with his daughter's death, with the point that he's, writing a book about his experience in 1408 and kind of putting that trauma behind him a little bit. It's the character changes so fundamentally by the end of the story, and I really love that he kind of reaches that point in the room where he's being taunted by the room, like, are you ready to check out? Which, by the way, he says early on about how rooms are, the banality of evil. He talks about, he says about how hotel rooms are designed to feel familiar, like you've been there before. They have that sort of like superficial, I don't know, politeness, for lack of a better word. So the fact that they have the Carpenters, We've Only Just Begun, and playing on the which is like the most vanilla song of all time, that they have the operator sort of like casually being like, are you ready to check out, Mr. Enslin? He's like, take advantage of our express checkout system. I think it really weaponizes all of those elements of what he's talking about that kind of inherently make hotels a creepy place. But the fact that it is taunting him that way and kind of giving him multiple ways in which he could just kill himself, because that's the room's whole game, is breaking you down psychologically until you just kill yourself, essentially. It's sort of the Jigsaw thing from the Saw franchise, just being like, well, he doesn't kill anybody, he just puts them in a position where they kill themselves. Because that's a franchise I talked about on my podcast a few months ago, and I think that's a really interesting kind of psychological angle that the movie plays with. But Enslin reaches that point where the noose is hanging up, and he's walking around, and he's like, "No, I'm not going out that way." You know, he actually stands firm and decides that if he's going to go, he's going to take the room with him. And I love that he reaches that point where he's actually fighting for something, and making some kind of change. He has this whole line about, I lived in life as a selfish man, but I don't have to die that way. And I think that's such a, I'm a sucker for redemption arcs, and I love the way that this movie portrays that. And I think that's a theme that's in a lot of King's work as well. It's just characters dealing with trauma, and that's a classic horror thing. Trauma or demons being sort of literally translated into an allegory, like Pennywise, for example, is an example of that. And I love the fact that this story at its heart is really about a man overcoming his tragic past and standing up for something, kind of moving past it. So I really like that aspect of it as well.
Right. And obviously this isn't a super old movie, but I've found as I go back and am watching through all of these adaptations, I can kind of see which ones have influenced present day horror filmmakers, because now that we're sitting here talking about this, I was thinking about it and I was like, this character in Mike Enslin is quite similar to the character in The Haunting of Hill House, the adaptation that Mike Flanagan did, where he's a writer and he writes about these sort of ghost stories, and then he goes to this place that sort of traps him all over again. And that is definitely a bit of a parallel to this. I can't speak as to whether or not Mike Flanagan has seen this movie. I imagine he has. He seems to be a big Stephen King fan. And just looking at those things is always very interesting. And I should note that John Cusack was previously in Stand By Me. He played Denny. So he wasn't new to the King universe, but he appears in it again later, like I mentioned in Cell. And I really think there are a lot of actors out there who are kind of drawn to Stephen King properties. Obviously, you have to go through auditions and things like that in order to get the roles, but we've seen so many people come back to Stephen King movies or TV shows, whether it's because they work well with the director, like we know when something is done by Mick Garris, Matt Frewer's probably going to appear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see that with filmmakers as well. I mean, Frank Darabont did 3 kind of pretty high profile King adaptations. So there's definitely a sort of regular what was it? Bill Skarsgård, who's cast in Castle Rock, and everybody's like, is he playing Pennywise? And like, no, he just likes to work. He's just like Stephen King material. I don't know.
Yeah, I always think those little connections are fun to make throughout this podcast. I've been trying to pick up on those, but I think this story is one that lends itself to being mostly set in one location, and the way they have that location change is what makes it so interesting, so that you don't get bored. First, you have, the clock turning to 60 and counting down. You have the painting on the wall that kind of gets shifted, and then you see the painting change. The wall splits, water comes in, the sprinklers turn on, it gets below 0 in there. The bathroom changes when he sees his father. So many things are going on in this room. We mentioned earlier that he opens the little mini fridge and he has this whole conversation with Mr. Olin in there. And, it's not a very long scene. So like you said, Samuel L. Jackson doesn't have a ton of screen time, but I feel like the screen time they do give him is pretty powerful, because we first see him, he's trying to dissuade Mike from going into the room. He's putting up all of these good arguments. He gives him this file and is like, here is what happened that didn't get reported by the media because it was natural causes, not suicide or weird things happening in the room. And obviously, we chalk it all up to weird things happening in the room as we go along. But I really felt like it was kept fresh and interesting by having the room change so much. And I don't know if I would call this a top tier adaptation just because there are so many that are really good. You mentioned Frank Darabont, who has done very good adaptations. You know, Mike Flanagan is someone who's putting his name on that list as well. And I think because I was pleasantly surprised by this, it is on the higher end of adaptations for me, for sure. But I've seen so many bad ones too that it's a pretty consistent line. It's like you have this line of what is a fine Stephen King adaptation, and there are certain ones that I think everyone knows are above that line, and then there are a bunch that fall below that line, which is unfortunate. But I think when it comes to the horror genre, you can have movies that aren't fantastic, but still really fun to watch. And I use Maximum Overdrive as this example so often on this podcast because that is not a good movie, but almost everyone I know who has seen it has had fun with it. And this, I think, falls under the good but not great category.
Right.
At least for me. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I really love this movie, but I mean, I think I'm also kind of a sucker for the, and as you said, this is, they do a lot to make it not feel like you're in the same room the whole time. He spends time crawling outside the building. There's a whole sequence where he's in the air ducts. And then, you know, well, obviously the movie toys with us and with Mike, making him feel like he's left the room, only to reveal that he's basically lived, I don't know, in his mind, weeks writing a whole other book. Only to reveal that he's been still in the room. And the movie kind of, you know, misdirects us, making it think it's going the dream route, that, it was all in his head. And for me, I'm kind of a sucker for isolated, kind of very focused storytelling like this, psychological horror, and just like the trauma aspect of it. Like I was bringing up, this movie really emotionally affected me then, and now my wife and I have a 4-year-old daughter. So now even more so, I'm like, oh my God, all the Katie stuff really, really, you know, hits me emotionally. Especially that's just that scene where obviously after the big reveal that he's still in the room, which, by the way, that's every writer's worst nightmare, kind of imagining you've written an entire book and then waking up and realizing you haven't even started it. That is something I can relate to as well. But that when Katie appears to him and is like, oh, you know, they won't let me stay. And he's like, I'm not going to lose you, blah, blah, blah. And then she literally dies in his arms. It's just so heart-wrenching. It's like the emotional stuff like that, I think, that elevates it to another level. And then she crumbles in his arms too, to make matters worse. But I think the part of what makes me also really champion this film, and why I was interested in talking about it for the podcast, is because how good it is and how well known it is are completely disconnected. Like, I feel like it's very strong, especially considering no one talks about it, you know? And I feel like that makes me like love it even more. But like, you know, there's a movie that came out a few years ago, not horror at all, but it's called Sing Street, that I love. A lot of people on film Twitter love, and it made like no money at the box office. And so that's one of those movies. And 1408, I kind of put in that category, that anytime I have the opportunity to be like, see this movie, you probably never even heard of it, check it out. And the fact that this was a box office hit, it made like 133 million worldwide in 2007 and got completely swept under the rug. I think it deserves to be brought up more when talking about the good King adaptations. Maybe it's not, you know, it's not as classic, obviously, as like Misery and things like that, but I think it's a solid entry at worst. And I think that it's a really interesting exploration of one man's kind of psychological breakdown, essentially. You know, we get flashbacks with him and Lily, critical points in their marriage when Katie was sick, and then the aftermath, and we start to you really get inside his head. and you understand why he got from point A to point B, why he's kind of in this hopeless place. And in that way, the movie is so absorbing for me personally. And the movie feels inescapable, like The Room itself in a lot of ways. And I think that's why, like I said, when I put it on for the first time in years last night, I just sat there transfixed for the whole time. Like I didn't get up to go to the bathroom or get a snack or anything. I was just like, I didn't want to ruin the momentum, because and this is also a testament to the difference of watching a movie at home versus watching a movie in the theaters. Obviously, these last year or so hasn't really worked out so well for theaters, but you don't have that opportunity to pause and step away. And I think watching it all in one fell swoop really benefits this movie, perhaps more than a lot of other horror films, because it is kind of, the middle section kind of happens almost in real time.
Right. You mentioned earlier too how this movie in particular kind of reminds you of some other Stephen King properties. You mentioned Misery, and I think for me, there are certain moments that sort of harken back to some other stories he's written, like when he goes out on the ledge and the building sort of just extends and there's suddenly no other windows. It reminded me a little of The Ledge in Cat's Eye, how the guy is sort of going on the ledge around the whole building, and obviously different outcomes for those two things, but just visually it instantly reminded me of that. And I think with the isolated feel, you could also compare this to Secret Window.
Yeah, I was actually, in preparation for this episode, I was listening to your Secret Window episode as well, because that's a movie that came out a few years before this that I also really liked, saw in theaters. Yeah. And Len Cariou, or however we say his name, who plays Mike's father in here, was in Secret Window as well. So there's another King connection. It feels like this movie has so many it's so many references and Easter eggs and amalgamations of different things within King's repertoire, but also in the horror community in general. And I love that kind of stuff too. It makes the movie that much richer.
Yeah, this is one I would definitely put in the same range as Secret Window for how much I enjoyed it. I've seen Secret Window a few times now, and I imagine at some point I will want to revisit this. Given the nature of the story that it's telling, it's not one that I think is quite as fun as some of the other adaptations. No. I imagine a lot of people rewatch, Kubrick's The Shining, even though that also has that sort of isolated feel, but just because of Jack Nicholson's performance in it, I think a lot of people will rewatch something like Pet Sematary, and I feel like those bigger titles, especially the new It movies as well, at least the first one I know a lot of people really, really love. The second one, some mixed feelings on it. But there are certain Stephen King movies that I think people want to rewatch all the time. But when you have things like Secret Window and 1408, the psychological breakdown doesn't make it quite as appealing to rewatch this, yearly or something like that. But I do think this is one that people should really check out if they haven't. And if you are listening to this, we've obviously spoiled quite a bit of it, but I think you don't really understand what this movie is about until you actually watch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I 100% agree with you. It's not really, and that's part of the reason I hadn't seen it in years, is that it's not necessarily a fun horror movie. It is kind of, for me at least, it's kind of emotionally draining by the end of it. It's more of an intense experience than, as you mentioned, something like It, which I'm in the minority, I feel like, in that I love both It Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. But those movies just, they feel more escapist in a way that 1408 doesn't really, because you spend so much of this time focused with this guy and his personal demons, and it doesn't have that, it doesn't have that, like, even that, like, macabre sense of humor as much like the It movies do.
Yeah, and because you're spending a lot of time with one person, you get a very different vibe off of this movie. And that's why, I think we kind of compared it to Secret Window and Misery, because those are movies that have much smaller casts. And so you can sort of see the parallels between those stories. And, I don't want to say that King writes similar stories all the time, because obviously he has a wide variety of stories. It's not like you can really compare The Dark Tower to Pet Sematary, for instance. Right. It's like, exactly. Sure, you might have some horror elements that appear in the Dark Tower series, and you might have some more supernatural stuff appearing in his quote unquote horror novels, but I really feel like he has a lot of different kinds of stories that he wants to tell, because this is not the same as Misery or Secret Window. There are some similarities, but the outcomes are very different for each of those stories.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I do want to ask though. I'm assuming you watched the standard, theatrical version in which Mike escapes the room at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, because there is at least one major alternate ending that's on the director's cut, that's in which he dies in the fire, and at his funeral, Olin tries to give the box of his effects. Have you seen any of this, or I don't want to know if...
Oh, actually, that is the version I watched.
Oh, you saw the one where he dies in the fire?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because the theatrical one, he survives and he reconciles with Lily, and they're going through his effects.
They made it look like he was going to survive, so my brain got confused a little. But
Yeah,
I
no.
did see the one where she goes to the building and it's already on fire. He's in there and you don't really see him die, so it's a little open-ended until you get to that funeral scene, and then
Right.
he has the box and sees him in the back seat, right?
Right, yeah. So the theatrical version that I saw initially, and the one that I actually watched both endings because I wanted to be able to talk about him. He survives, he reconciles with Lily, he writes the book about all of it, about 1408 and everything, and then he has the tape recorder, he plays it, and they both hear Katie's voice on there, basically confirming his account of what happened in the room, basically confirming the existence of an afterlife, essentially. And then they're like, she drops a box of whatever she's holding, and they kind of look at each other, and that's the end in the theatrical cut. And the alternate ending, which some versions of the movie I think just use it as the actual ending, is the one where he dies in the fire, the funeral with Olin, and he's in the back seat, and then we cut back to the room where Enslin is in there smoking and then disappears, hearing Katie's voice. Which of those endings? I guess you saw the one ending, but were you satisfied with the way that it ended? That he sacrificed himself to destroy the room? Because I kind of feel like that would in a way make it more powerful. But I like I was saying earlier, I like the redemption arc of it as well. So I'm kind of torn on which ending, whether it makes more sense or makes this film stronger for him to sacrifice himself in the fire, or be able to kind of live on, like learning from that experience.
I did enjoy the ending enough, and apparently there's actually another alternate ending. I'm just reading this right now as we go, because I had a digital copy that I was watching, so I didn't pay close attention to which version I was watching, and I think the theatrical one is almost too much of a happy ending. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of weird to me when Stephen King stories get happy endings. And if I'm not mistaken, none of these endings actually match the end of the story. So I think having him make the ultimate sacrifice to die in the room, and you have that line from Mr. Olin where he's kind of saying he did the right thing, because it seems like the hotel either isn't going to repair the room, or they're going to repair it and then not let anyone stay there ever again.
Yeah. It's unclear what the future of the Dolphin Hotel is, but he defeated the evil that was in the room. And then I think that there's also, this is just, I feel like a theory that I've heard. Do you think that there's a possibility that Olin sent Mike the postcard? Because we never get any explanation on that, and where he got that postcard from, because you could almost view it as, if you and this is obviously just a speculation at this point, you could almost view it as him trying to find someone that would be willing to destroy the room, but still wanting to discourage them enough so that he doesn't have it on his conscience, that if things go bad because of the danger of 1408. Because we do have that moment at the end where he's kind of congratulating Mike for triumphing over 1408. I like that they leave little things like that open for interpretation. So that if you want to consider that to be the case, you can, but they don't really clear it up one way or another.
Yeah, I kind of love when some stuff like that is left open-ended. Obviously, with the director's cut, you get that sort of definitive ending, but it really does feel like it had to have been someone at the hotel who had a knowledge of what had happened in room 1408 who sent the postcard, because we see that when he collects his mail, he has a bunch of brochures from these supposedly haunted places, and he kind of just flips through most of them. But then this one grabs his attention because someone hand wrote the note, "Don't go in 1408." So it piques his curiosity, and he sees it as a challenge. And it is a little odd that he doesn't question who it came from. But at the same time, I feel like, given the nature of what he writes about,
Exactly.
it was just something where he was like, okay, someone is telling me this. There's a mystery behind it because he doesn't know who sent it. So that just kind of pushes him in the direction of leaving right away almost and going there. And you have some scenes that replay later on in the movie. And that's what kind of gives you this idea that, oh, maybe it was just a dream, and it turns out it wasn't. And I love that they weren't just like, here is exactly what is happening. Instead, they leave at least some of it open to interpretation. And I think a lot of King stories do that as well. He has definitely had some open-ended endings in his stories. And you have these endings where sometimes he'll take it a step too far and put in an epilogue that maybe doesn't need to be there. But I really feel like doing things like that is what made this really feel like a Stephen King adaptation, even though the ending wasn't the same as the story.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. It touches, it feels in a lot of ways like a quintessential Stephen King story, because it has so many elements and has so many references to other stories and other adaptations of his work. But yeah, I think the big takeaway for listeners is just the movie is definitely worth watching, and I feel like it's gotten lost to time. And now, I think the fact that Cusack and Jackson co-starred in Cell, which is basically a universally despised movie, I would say. I feel like
heard.
This kind of gets lumped in. Did you like that one? I haven't seen it, actually.
I haven't seen it yet either. I know it's coming up, but I think that one got adapted quite a bit later. I think it's like 2014 or 2016 or something. So since I'm going through chronologically, I'm kind of in this space where it's like, we got a few good adaptations in this and The Mist, and then things get a little iffy from there.
Yeah. It's crazy how yes, King adaptations gets kind of ebb and flow. Like, you get a nice string of solid ones, and then sort of a darker period, and then it comes back around. But I feel like since these two actors were also in Cell, I feel like now it kind of retroactively taints this movie in a way that they're like, oh, they did another one together? I don't need to watch that. I'm like, no, but you should. It's so good.
Yeah.
So I hope that people listening to this, even though we spoiled it, will either check it out, and it's not streaming anywhere either. I had to go and we're in the process of moving to a different house, and I had to go to the storage unit where a lot of my movies are and pull out my DVD from the box that it's in order to watch it. It's not really streaming, so that makes it a little less accessible. But we would definitely encourage people to check it out if they haven't seen it, or to revisit it if they haven't seen it since 2007, because it's worth kind of a refresh, I would say.
Yeah, it is a bummer that it's not streaming anywhere, but you can rent it too. It's only $3.99 to rent. I think it's $9.99 to buy right now. And I think it's definitely worth that price tag because it has a great cast. It's a movie that doesn't overextend its stay. I feel like movies now keep getting longer and longer. And I'm just like, can we go back to like the 90 to 110 minute movies? And, this one, I think it was around an hour and 45 minutes. It wasn't too terribly long, and I don't need every Stephen King adaptation to be as long as Shawshank or The Green Mile. Those are stories that lend themselves to the long runtime, but when something is a little shorter in length story-wise, and when it's this isolated, I don't think it needs to be as long. So I think this hit that sort of sweet spot for the runtime too.
Yeah, it's a very lean movie, I would say. There's nothing in here that doesn't feel relevant at some point. Even when he's screaming in the refrigerator at Mr. Olin. I think it's establishing a lot about the character, about the room itself, and then you have that great cut where it cuts away from him seeing Olin in the fridge to him screaming into an empty fridge and like losing his shit. And I love that it makes that point even more. It makes that point even more obvious that how much he's kind of devolved mentally, that he's just like kind of in that crazed state by that point in the movie. So yeah, I think it's very wisely nice, a nice trim, like hour and 40 so minutes.
Yeah, and I mentioned that this is in sort of the good but not great tier for me. So one of the things I like to do is quickly go through ratings for how we feel about these. And I gave this a 3.5 out of 5. So that's pretty good. Typically anything that's a 3 or above for a Stephen King adaptation, that's all good in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. For me, this is more like a 4.5 out of 5. Like I really like this movie a lot, and it's I agree with you. It's not like something fun to be like, oh, let's get a group of friends together and watch 1408. It's not one of those kinds of movies for sure. But for what it's trying to do, I think the performances and the direction, and I think I even had the score on CD somewhere in my house. I think all of it is like this. We didn't even mention the sound design. I think all of it is so technically well done, and the story is very engrossing, and the performances are top notch. So I like it a lot. I think with the caveat, again, of course, that it's not something that I will put on constantly. I need a break from it every once in a while. But yeah, it's definitely a really strong psychological horror film, so highly recommended.
Yeah, and Robert, since I totally spaced on doing this at the beginning of the episode, this is your first time on the podcast, so why don't you just tell everyone a little about yourself? I know you have a podcast that you mentioned earlier. Where can they find you on social media?
So I host the Crooked Table podcast. We look at the world of film from a fresh angle. Every episode, myself and a guest talk about a movie, sometimes of their choice, sometimes just something that kind of comes about organically. And you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, a bunch of other podcatchers, as well as crookedtable.com. And on Twitter at Crooked Table, same for Instagram and all that. So yeah, definitely, Deanna, you're welcome to come on the show at some point this year. I'm in that early part of the year period where I'm trying to like take a break, reassess, recalibrate the show, and then come back strong in like late January. So we should definitely try and get you on an episode.
Yeah, I would love to. I am always a fan of being on a podcast that I don't have to edit.
Yeah, right? Same.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for coming on to talk about 1408. I look forward to us discussing some more stuff in the future, whether it's here or on my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom. I'm sure we will talk again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deanna. This was a blast.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon. For $1 a month, you'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.